Thank you everyone for joining us today for another installment of the Advanced Work Packaging Community of Practice webinar series. Today, of course, is ConstructX with Ted Weitzman. Lloyd will introduce Ted. Before we get going, I just want to again thank you for registering and let you know there will be ample time for Q&A, and you can submit questions either through the questions panel in your attendee toolbox or through the chat window. I strongly recommend sending them through the questions panel. That way you can guarantee that our presenter will see your question and have a better chance of having it addressed. So without further ado, Lloyd Rankin of Group ASI will introduce Ted and today's session.
Thank you very much, Steve, and welcome everyone. We've been having a lot of webinars lately, and fortunately the attendance seems to be very good, so we're obviously presenting topics that people are interested in. Before I introduce Ted, I'm just going to go a little bit, go through the community of practice a little bit. So Ted, would you mind moving us to the next slide? For those of you who are regulars, you've heard this before, but really the vision of the Advanced Work Packaging Community of Practice is to have construction be safer, more effective, and more efficient. And I think that we're finding globally there's a lot of interest in that vision. Next. And our mission is to create a community that allows us to share knowledge, encourage discussion, and promote adoption of advanced work packaging, but also other construction-related productivity initiatives. And that would be things like Lean and BIM and digital twins. And so you're going to notice that a number of our topics relate to data and technology, and that's because we see that as part of an overall solution for improving construction productivity. We've sent out a survey that we would like you to take a few minutes to fill in. It's accessible from our website, but we're basically going to be using this information to craft what presentations, what services that we offer to you. So the more we know about what you're interested in, the more we can provide you with that. So please, if you would, take a moment to answer that survey. Next, I'd just like to talk about the AWP Research Virtual Summit. Basically, there's been a number of research teams at CII that have been working for anywhere from 1 to 2 years researching topic areas of interest to the AWP community. And normally they would be presenting out at the CII conference, but CII approached Group ASI and asked us to help them organize the event. And it's going to happen on the 1st and 2nd of September. Whereas in the past, normally you'd have to be a CII member to attend, this event is open to members of CII, members of the AWP COP community, and just people interested in the topic of advanced work packaging. One of the things that we've been able to do is we've been able to negotiate with CII that all members of the COP will get a reduced rate over the general public. So we strongly recommend, if you're interested in attending this event, and we think it's going to be a great one, join the COP if you haven't already, given that you're not a CII member, and you will get a discounted rate. They're also selling sponsorships for the event, and the sponsorship rate is lower for COP members than the general public, but not quite as low as the CII rate. So if you have any questions about this, please reach out to Group ASI and we can answer them for you. But we think this is going to be a great event. You know, if you want to improve your supply chain, if you want to improve how you do commissionings, completions, and startup, if you want to know how to better use the information on AWP and help other stakeholders know how to use that information, if you want to learn about AWP data requirements and how that might impact your contracts, or how to use digital threads to improve your supply chain visibility, then this is your event, because they're going to have information on all those areas. And then finally, we have two conferences coming up, one in London and one in Houston. The one in London is going to be on the 13th and 14th. The one in Houston is going to be on the 27th and 28th. And the good news is, while there will be a physical conference, we're also going to have a virtual conference available for both events. So it'll be simulcast. You'll be able to see track sessions. It'll be very similar to the physical event. It just will make it possible to attend without travel, and the cost will be significantly lower than the physical event. So we'll be getting some information out on the virtual event and the physical event in the next 1 to 2 weeks. We've got quite a few details. The program has come together, and I think people will be quite interested in what we're going to be presenting. So I've taken up enough of your time. I know you're not here to see me or hear me. You're here to see Ted and what he's got to talk to you about digitally enabled AWP. So Ted, could you introduce yourself and give us some information on this valuable topic area?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, Lloyd. And first I want to say thank you to both you and your team and the AWP community practice for giving me this opportunity. And I'm going to show my agenda real quick. I've got a lot of material to cover in a short period of time. Any one of these topics could take up an hour or two, but I want to kind of go through this as with as much information as possible, but also as quickly as possible, so that we can get to some Q&A, where I think we'll probably have the most value and as much dialogue as we can generate today. And I want to thank everybody for attending. So I am going to do a safety topic and a brief introduction to both myself and ConstructX. And then we're going to dive in a little bit to digitally enabled AWP, and in particular talk about systems architecture and digital threads. That was mentioned just a minute ago in a previous slide in relationship to one of the CII projects, which is digital threads for supply chain visibility. And my experience has taught me that there are quite a few questions still about what a digital thread is. So I hope to demystify that a little bit in preparation for talking about how they were leveraged in this CII effort to create a comprehensive set of AWP data requirements that are very soon to be published. And I want to talk about how those came about, why they came about, and what you can expect in the very near future around CII and the AWP data requirements. So with that, safety does matter, of course, and my safety topic today is on breathing deeply. This is an area where I can continually seek to improve. I tend to hold a lot of tension in my body, and I do not always breathe deeply. But unfortunately, not breathing deeply can lead to several very high-risk health issues, not the least of which are high blood pressure and heart disease. So if we can take some time to do deep breathing on a daily basis, especially in this current environment where we're dealing with a lot of external stresses, many of us are in unusual circumstances and working from home. And just a heads up about that, I've got 4 little kids aged 2 to 11 in my house today, and hopefully we won't get any interruptions. I've asked them to please not interrupt me in my less than ideal workspace, but if you hear some kid noise, that's why. And of course, all these little things, as much of some of this is a blessing, a lot of it can cause stress and create a lot of tension in the body. But if you can, just breathe deeply a couple of times a day. It will decrease stress, increase calm, it can relieve pain, improves immunity, of course, reduces blood pressure. It can even improve digestion. And it can help support your posture, which is another thing I continually struggle with. Just want to show this, and of course this will be available through the recorded webinar as an exercise on how to breathe deeply. I'm not going to go through every single step here. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it is important to, yes, I'm sorry. It is important to, if you're going to breathe deeply, to follow these steps, and also that will be available. I don't expect anybody to copy these down real quickly, but maybe you can get it on the recording. Additional resources if you're interested in the practice of deep breathing to reduce stress and help prevent a lot of those ailments that can be caused by shallow breathing. All right, with that, I am Ted Weitzman. I am the Director of Delivery Excellence for ConstructX. I've been at ConstructX for about 1.5 years now. I started early January of last year after serving 18 years or thereabouts at Southern Company. And that entire time at Southern Company was in their engineering and construction services organization, where we supported either the build and or maintenance of a fleet of power generation for fossil, hydro, and also renewables. Had a lot of experiences there in those 18 years. I cut my teeth in electrical retrofits, but I spent about the last decade with a focus on asset lifecycle information management. And because Southern Company had this integrated, basically EPC, at cost EPC that was integrated into the business, we had purview over the entire life cycle of assets, from their conceptual design all the way through their operations and maintenance and eventual decommissioning. And I was able to touch and facilitate activity around all those points in the life cycle. I'm not going to read through my bio here, but again, it's available as well. And I also consider myself pretty available if you want follow-up. But there's a good bit of experience here around capital project execution, brownfield project executions, and information management as it relates to assets. I left very amicably in January of last year. Southern Company just personally was in a thought process of either I'm going to complete my tenure at Southern Company and gun for the Rolex, or if I'm ever going to make a change in my mid-40s, now is the time to do it. And ultimately made the decision to leave that home at Southern Company where I basically grown up and go on a new adventure. And that adventure was with ConstructX, which is a boutique consulting company with a specialty in AWP and lean construction. But that's selling it a little bit short. We span a tremendous breadth of consulting expertise from the entire asset lifecycle. And it's not just a focus on AWP, but we do have a specialty there and a deep strength in AWP consulting. And I will also say that we are part of a broader family of companies, and a lot of those are technology companies. The ConstructX is vendor agnostic, of course, as a consultant, but where we find gaps in industry, we do have partner companies that have technologies that fill those gaps. And you will actually see one of those products today, but this is definitely not a product demonstration, but just want to put a few things in context there. With that, we're going to jump into the presentation itself, which is digitally enabled AWP and, of course, the CII data requirements. And I really want to focus on the CII data requirements. So I'm going to kind of very high level go through digitally enabled AWP. I think most on the call are either AWP practitioners at some point along their maturity curves and AWP deployments within their companies. At least that's an assumption that I'm making, that everybody has some familiarity with AWP. But just as a reminder, what we're looking for is to reduce cost, to improve time on tools, basically to improve productivity on our projects and make sure that we are as efficient as possible with our dollars in the execution of those projects. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I think everybody's got some familiarity with AWP and its benefits. But I do want to focus on this. The benefits of AWP have been proven, and they're documented, and there are plenty of studies out there, either CII or other organizations who have done research on the benefits that AWP can bring to projects. But the effective implementation of an AWP automation system is non-trivial and important to reaping the full benefit of an AWP program. And really what's happening is more and more people, especially folks on the business side of these organizations, are realizing more and more that it is all about the data. And one of the gaps that we have in the industry right now is integration and processing of data in an AWP framework across vendor applications. Hopefully that wasn't a bunch of word salad, and for those that are in the process of implementation, have some understanding of the challenges related to implementing data strategies in an AWP framework. But ConstructX, we've spent a lot of time on this problem and addressing this industry issue, and I'm just going to start at a very high level and say this is an example of an AWP framework. It is somewhat genericized, just to be able to demonstrate it to a broad audience of companies. But in essence, these are the applications and the integrations that are required to digitally enable AWP. And again, I'm not gonna, I could probably focus, an hour's worth of time just on this slide and related discussions, but again, it's not the focus of today. What I actually want to do is demystify that phrase digital thread a little bit as it relates to this AWP framework. Because everywhere where you see an arrow here, these double arrows back and forths are a place where you need a digital thread in order to really enable AWP for projects. And a digital thread, I'm going to go ahead and jump here, and I'm going to open up an application right now called Borneo, where this, we call this the spider diagram, lives, which is also kind of diving down a little bit, but still genericized for industry based on ConstructX experience. We've created this map of digital threads that allow you to enable AWP projects. If this were in practice in at a company, what you would do here is, instead of these being very generic, like an equipment design or a 3D plant design, this would be replaced by an actual application name. And this AWP data thread would have a title and a name that relates to that application. And what we can do here in this Borneo system, which again, I don't have enough time to dive into this application today, and it's not the point of the demonstration, is not the point of this talk today. But what I can do in this Borneo system is actually drill down into a digital thread to support AWP. And what a digital thread does, embedded in it, is a data requirement, right? A very specific data requirement for an application-to-application integration. But it is far more than that. It also overviews the business purpose for implementing the digital thread. So you've got a function, you've got obviously a reference to the data fields, which I'll show you in a second. We have sample data, which is very important in the execution to demystify any questions related to the data and how in its format. You also relate it very specifically to a timing and frequency. So it's very explicit within the context of a project execution when the transfer of data is happening, and many of these are regularly, weekly. Which also indicates that you need to have good change management in place for your data. That's a conversation for another talk as well. It indicates your sources, right? And again, this has been genericized a little bit for industry. This isn't specific to a client, but here, if it was specific to a client, you'd have an explicit reference to the sources of the data. And of course, the destination of where that data comes once it's received. We associate these to work processes as well, because too often the data side of the equation for AWP is somewhat removed and sort of a mystery as it relates to the processes that the business are executing, right? So we make an effort very explicitly to tie the data thread to primary and secondary activities, business activities that are happening in the project execution. So that's the why. Why are we handling and transforming, or whatever it is, with this data in the context of the project? And then one of the most important things is who's responsible, the team roles. So we've identified this data thread. We know why it's important. We know what the frequency is going to be, but these are the responsibility, accountability, supporting whatever the role is to actually execute that digital thread. And I want to indicate that these are not IT folks, so you're not limited to non-IT folks, but in this case, as a generic example, these are roles within the organization executing the project who have some responsibility for the data. And when we drill in here, I'm just going to go to, let's say, materials inventory, which is one of the sub-threads. The main thread is DT27. This is sub-thread 3. and it very clearly indicates the fields and the definition of those fields that are required to execute that digital thread. Okay, and this would be the data requirement piece of the digital thread. And I sort of outline this to emphasize that a digital thread is a specific thing. It's not some strange entity that doesn't have a definition, at least in the context of the way that ConstructX deploys them. And I think that most people who have dug into this type of information management are aware of. When I was at Southern Company, I didn't call this digital threading. I called it integrated data requirements and documenting your integrated data requirements, which basically demystifies the process of handling data. Because unfortunately for a lot of people, especially on the business side, there's a lot of mystery in the way that information is managed sort of on the back end. And what I say is that this is really a business level activity. It's not necessarily an IT activity, even though you probably could use some IT support, but the business has to take ownership of these digital threads and their documentation, because ultimately the data that's being represented here supports the business. It's not some pie in the sky or some abstracted IT event. It's to support the business, and the digital thread documentation helps you explicitly understand and know how you're supporting the business in the execution of the digital thread. That's about the quickest crash course I can do in digital threading. Again, this is a topic that could be probably an hour in and of itself. So I would love to have a follow-up on that as well. So ConstructX, through its experience and its support of clients and development of and deployment of AWP projects, has generated this great wealth of content around digital threads and the digital threads that are really required to support AWP implementations. And that's just sort of IP that we've developed over time and just have always sort of had in our back pocket, or being continually developing as we work with clients. And we abstract that and turn it into a set of sort of generic digital threads to display for this type of instance. It's important to understand what you want to achieve. We talked a little bit about the digital thread and its documentation, but the whole point of the digital threading is to greatly reduce the manual handling of data, right? Use automation as much as possible to flag data issues and to get those discrepancies and get prompt action for remediation against the discrepancies that are coming, especially in your time frequent data exchanges. You also want to stop invalid data from progressing early, right? Prevent issues from escalating and multiplying on your project, because I think I'd imagine that most on the call have experienced some issues with bad data that gets propagated on a project and the difficulty that it may cause. And the other thing that you want to attempt to do through these digital threads is to automate as much as possible the transformation of data to the format required for applications, so that it's not an individual every time they're receiving data from some source having to go in and manipulate it manually. So the goal is full automation of the import and export of information across applications, right? In order to do that, you've got to go through this exercise of documenting your digital threads. But that is not to be done in a vacuum and for its own purpose. It's to achieve the business goals. And as it relates to AWP, very specifically, it's to increase efficiency of workplace planning, right? Reduce the need for manual data entry, system uploads, and data validation cleanup. Resolve typical project challenges of pulling, let's say, materials management info into workplace planning. And of course, the target goal is issuance 100% of constraint-free IWPs. I mean, that's the end game. It's not that, hey, pat ourselves on the back, we can manage all this data. It's how are we supporting these activities as it relates to a project. All right, from there, I'm going to shift gears a little bit and try to relate all of that previous sort of ConstructX oriented talk about digital threads and relate it to what happened at CII over the past year around AWP data requirements. And I'm going to hang on this slide for a minute and actually jump into a more a less prescribed portion of this dialogue for me. I've been doing information management for a long time. I was the inaugural chair of the CII Technology Committee, which was previously FIATech, where I was also a board member. and have supported, and I'm a board member of Mimosa, which is a standards body organization. I'm very familiar with ISO 15926 and other data reference standards that are being propagated in industry that are really trying to federate data to make all those transformations and exchanges of data a lot easier. And I think most on the call, if you're familiar with that, we're not quite there yet. But we're working diligently, and I've been part of many teams working towards that end goal. So, CII annual conference last year in August. ConstructX had donated some IP to the AWP Community for Business Advancement, which is an entity that maybe some are also participating on that are part of this community practice. And it was a maturity matrix for AWP, and there was a session, an evening session over dinner that the CBA hosted, where it was basically a workshop to introduce that maturity matrix to CII and actually go through the exercise of filling it out and executing it and improving it. And that was pretty much the entire agenda for that CBA meeting in San Diego last year. An attendee was Jay Moser, who may be on this call today, of that meeting, heard the agenda, and before the meeting started, basically stood up and said, you know, this is great, but we're not leaving this session without talking about AWP data requirements. And everybody kind of nodded their heads, but the evening went about. We had food, we had drinks, we had fun going through the maturity matrix, and the meeting was about to close out. It was around 8:30 at night, and Jay stood up and said, I was serious. We're not leaving tonight without talking about AWP data requirements. And of course, Jay Moser is with the Shell organization. So it created a very interesting dialogue. It was executed relatively quickly, given the subject matter. But what Jay basically called for was, and he stated, you know, was I think he used the word shameful, that we are in, at that time, 2019, we've been talking about data requirements and data for AWP for a long time, but there is still no, or at that time, there was no sort of reference documentation that a company could point to and say, there are the AWP data requirements, right, that have been sort of blessed and approved by industry. And he made a very specific call to solve this problem by the end of the year. Keep in mind, this is August. And very specific call to CII members to solve this problem by the end of the year. Upon Jay saying that, many of the other folks from owner organizations in the room stood up and said, yes, we agree. They included Eastman Chemical, Exxon, Southern Company, I think was in there as well, Dow, and there was probably one or two other ones that I'm not remembering right now. But there was sort of this voice of the owner saying, we want the AWP data requirements documented by the end of the year. So that was the charge, that was the challenge. And Eric Cravella, who is the chair of the AWP CBA for CII, called a meeting for the following week to assemble a small team of folks to see how we can address this challenge. I came in, I thought about it for a week, and I thought, how are we going to do this, especially by the end of the year, because these type of activities usually take a lot longer than months. You know, it's usually years, 2 years at a minimum, even if you can get it done by then. But I was also confident that it could be done, especially if we could sit it on top of the IP and the work that ConstructX had already done. And ConstructX had already committed to donating some of that IP to CII in relationship to that project that you saw earlier around the supply chain digital threads for supply chain visibility. And I knew that there was an appetite at ConstructX to donate that IP to CII for this type of effort. So I came into that meeting that Eric called, and I proposed a way forward to execute this work. And it first involved the formation of a new team, a new entity within CII called the AWP Joint Working Group, where we could muster the call and the people to the resources to execute the task. And then also that once we form that team, which would have a lot of purposes within CII, but its main focus immediately would be the data requirements, would also be to proposed to that team being formed the utilization of the ConstructX digital threads as a starting point to start the data requirements work for AWP. Basically, that was blessed in that meeting to move forward with that concept, that idea. The following week, so we're towards the end of August, we formed the AWP Joint Working Group and had its first meeting. I apologize for the background noise. And then formed a subcommittee immediately from there. So the Joint Working Group formed as basically a steering committee for the sub team that would actually work on the data requirements. And I call out the core team here, the data requirements core team, which had very strong owner representation, as you can see here, and then support from vendor suppliers, EPCs. It was a really diverse and what I will say a dedicated group of individuals that really set to work in September of last year. They did bless the utilization of the ConstructX digital threads. And basically what they did with the digital threads was mine those for the data requirement piece. The first activity they did, oops, I'm sorry about that. I think that I did not progress the slides properly. There we go. I want to hang on this for just a second because I want this team to really be highlighted. The experience, and we'll talk about this more in other sessions moving forward. But the way that this team formed and the way that it executed work, and I will say without ego and with strong desire to complete the task, was really something to behold. It's one of the best working teams, especially industry working teams I've ever participated on. I'm very thankful for all the individuals that contributed here. Definitely would not be possible. We would not be here without them. But the first thing that team did, that working group, was take this high-level process map from RT272, which was the CII documentation for AWP, and map the digital threads and transform them from digital threads into data requirements to this process diagram. And then from there, the team went in and actually created all what they determined from an industry perspective, all the necessary fields and categories of fields to support AWP on project implementations. What I show here is just a screenshot of basically the index of the current draft of the data requirements. And I'm going to pull that actual document up right now. And what you can see here is they broke down the 30 some odd digital threads coming from ConstructX and broke them down to 21 that they considered essential. And of course, they fall into these main categories, and most of them have these sub threads. Like pipe detailing is actually 3 different tables, right? One is for isometric detailing, one is for isometric transmittals, and then the other one is how to organize pipe spools by CWP. So many of the threads break down to this type of organization where you have a master category and then some supporting threads to actually execute that in practice. I have to emphasize that these are not an international or industry standard. In order to execute the work, we were very clear and specific that this was not a standards bodies work, which is very time consuming and requires a certain level of rigor and approval that this team was never going to have, especially given the time frame that it was asked to execute the work. So this basically becomes a set of reference material that is blessed by industry to feed those international standards bodies that are more into reference data, let's say, than data requirements, if that makes sense. But the team did. They successfully, by the end of last year, had made the first pass through all of these data requirements. And this year was published internally. One second. Was published internally to CII, and that's just a screenshot of one of the some of the fields and the field names and the definitions from the actual data requirement. And those were published internally for review. And what the team is currently working on is an implementation guideline that will accompany these data requirements. that give insight into the reasoning behind some of the specific tables that are in the threads, and also how a company would use that information to better their AWP implementations. So the first draft of that guideline will actually be complete next week, and then it will go through some cycles within CII internally before it's published, but we're looking to accelerate the publication of both the data requirements document itself, the workbooks, and this implementation guideline to CII, which will not be limited to view of members only. It will be made available to all of industry. It's one of those high value set of documentations that CII does not want to keep close to its chest, nor do its member companies. It's something that we want all of industry to be able to benefit from. And that's the short story. So like I said, a lot of information to cover in a short period of time. We've got less than 25 minutes left, and I wanted to leave ample time for communication and dialogue with this team that's present. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and move to a Q&A period.
Great, thank you, Ted. And there are a couple of questions submitted already through the questions pane. Are you able to see those?
I do not see. I only see the chat.
Okay, no worries. I can read them to you as they come in. Do you use the CFI HOS data model as a basis for the data thread? From Eric.
Yeah, the answer to that question is no. I mean, explicitly no. Were they generated with eventually coordination with CFOS and other standards bodies? Yes. And the way that is happening within CII is that the technology committee has a subcommittee called the interoperability subcommittee. And the intent was always to hand these data requirements over to the interoperability subcommittee to interface with the standards bodies to make sure that the data requirements are captured within the body's work, like CFOS or even ISO or Mimosa. So there was no direct sort of engagement with CFOS in the development of the data requirements, but there was certainly an intent to coordinate with CFOS moving forward around those data requirements.
Okay, excellent. Hopefully that helps, Eric. And Eric also added, when is the publishing planned?
Yeah, so like I said, the data requirements have already been published internally to CII, and the data requirements, the workbook itself. The guideline is being completed as we speak, and we'll go through some review cycles. We are looking to accelerate. There's some process within CII, vetting that you have to go through before you can publish content. We are looking to accelerate the time frame that usually takes, and we have owner support to do that within CII to get them out. I would love to see them out by mid-July. That might be pushing it a little bit, but that would be my time frame that I would really drive us towards.
Okay, great. A comment actually just from Jay Moser. Awesome work by this work group. Looking forward to a final product. Just wanted to pass that on to you.
Thank you, Jay.
Vishnu Priya asks, can you explain a bit more about how these data requirements are different from industry data standard?
Yeah, so when you look at something like ISO or what's happening at CFOS, right, around reference data and the creation of reference data, there is a tremendous amount of rigor around, let's say, field names, right, where people will split hairs and you go through committees just talking about what a field is going to be named. One of the major differences between this work and that work is that we use generic field names. This is not meant to say this module will be the name for this definition from now through eternity, right? That's not the intent here. The intent here is to say there's a data requirement. We're going to call it module for right now, and this is its description. But when you take it into practice or when you apply it to any standard, it's very likely to change field name. And I would say that that's one of the main differences between what I call this data requirement and the work of an official standards body blessing things for industry. And the reason why we did that again is because in order to answer this call to execute this work in a very short period of time, there was no way we were going to get the consensus to say, yes, this is the field name, hence now and forever across all applications, right? That was not the intent of this documentation of the data requirements. I'll also follow that with one of the main uses of these data requirements is less around, let's say, the digital threading work. It can certainly inform the digital threading work, but these data requirements are not really what you would take into a production environment with digital threads and application-to-application integrations. This is something that you would use, let's say, contractually to reference when you're, let's say, an owner is developing its contracts for its partners on a project execution to say, look, this is an AWP 3D model data requirement that's being shown right here. This is the type of information that we are requiring you to provide contractually in the execution of the project. We can either work the details out in the contract itself, but this is why we're referencing them. This is the reference. It's a CII data requirement reference. It's something that has been blessed by industry, and these are the fields or the field types that support an AWP implementation. So this is a high level as opposed to a granular document for the support of AWP. It also I would say very accurately and consistently documents those requirements if an organization is sort of low on the maturity curve of AWP and just doesn't really know where to start. They can come here to the CII AWP data requirements and get an understanding or an idea of what kind of data they're going to be looking for across those different categories. I hope that makes sense.
Okay, excellent. And if you need further clarification, please feel free to submit a follow-up question to that. Question from Abhishek: have you come across any company that provides solutions which provide end-to-end material traceability, which is the source for any project?
The answer is I'm going to say yes with a little bit of hesitation in my voice, and it's not that. I think the technology is there. The devil is in the details of the implementation, which actually kind of goes to the digital thread supply chain project through the technology committee of CII that is addressing that more explicitly. It's less about the providers and more about an understanding of what data is required to actually do that, right? To have end-to-end visibility over your supply chain. So it's sort of a hesitant yes. It's not that I've seen a perfect implementation. I've seen some companies do it better than others. I'm not going to say that it's been with a quote-unquote specific provider, but a collaboration of IT and business entities with their applications, making that data available in an integrated way that allows you to see and view the necessary components of material as it goes through a project. So what I'll say is that I firmly believe it's possible. We could certainly help you out with that, but to say that there's a single provider that does that on a project, no.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. Another comment from Jay Moser. Ted, please make all aware that these data requirements should allow EPCs, technology and software companies to work with one standard, and that it will be the same across multiple owners, standardize and replicate. Any comments on?
Yeah, absolutely. I probably haven't emphasized that enough, especially as it relates to differentiating this between the data requirements between let's say reference data standard or something like that. These are fully intended to be the mechanism that partners on projects communicate and consolidate around a standard set of requirements for AWP on a project. Absolutely, that is the intent. And what you will see, and I've already started working with some owner companies and integrating these CII data requirements into their contractual guidelines, right? How do you use the CII data requirement to really write a contract, let's say with an owner with an EPC, and how you reference them and how you use them to explicitly outline your data requirements for an AWP execution. Absolutely.
Perfect, thank you. Shiv just wants to say thank you, Ted, for an excellent presentation.
You're most welcome, Shiv.
Henry asks, how does the AWP model work hand in hand with the traditional way of doing construction in the field and measuring construction status?
Wow.
Big question.
Yeah, a little tangential to this very specific set of topics, and would be a conversation for probably another presentation. So can you repeat that question just to make sure I get all the components there?
Oh, my apologies. I moved it out of the queue. So
okay. So what I heard is, based on a traditional execution of a construction project, how does AWP, what changes does AWP bring to that construction project execution? And that is a big question, if I remembered it correctly. So here's what I'm going to answer that by saying this is how we, as a consulting firm, approach companies executing construction work. It's not that there's a fundamental change in the way that you execute a lot of your work. There are definitely some changes that will be required, especially as it relates to the way that data and information is managed for a project. But the intent in our consulting business isn't to step in and just wholesale change everything based on AWP best practice. We step in and we look at how construction is being executed, very specifically, usually for a very specific project and site, but sometimes from an organizational perspective. How are you executing your projects? Do you have documentation on that? And then we say, well, this is what actually applies to AWP best practice, right? And that was part of that maturity assessment, right? The maturity assessment lists a bunch of AWP capability. And what we will do is go in and do an assessment and apply whatever they call their current practice to AWP and say, well, this is where you're actually executing AWP and might not know it. Because the reality is, and I had a conversation with a prospect client last week in their team, where we did a demo that was pretty AWP heavy, but it's not an AWP organization. But our demo had a lot of AWP language, and one of the leaders in that conversation stopped and made sure that with his team there was an explicit understanding that, look, this might be called AWP, and you might say, well, we're not doing AWP, but make no mistake that we're packaging. Constructors have been packaging for eons, right? It's basically how work is executed. What I would say is that AWP brings a very specific framework and organization to the way that you're packaging to exploit a return on investment, right? To increase productivity even more, depending on where your maturity is in your organization. So I don't know that I can answer that really even in the next 12 minutes, even with any more detail than I just did. But the answer is that, an intelligent implementation of an AWP program for construction takes into account all the activity that is currently happening around process, procedure, and execution of projects, but then augments that or changes some of it to a better practice within an AWP framework. And please reach out to me if we want to dig into any specific details.
Perfect. Yeah, we'll include a way to contact Ted in the follow-up email to all registrants when we send out the recording to this. So thanks so much for that question and for your answer, Ted. Here's a question from Joseph. I'll leave it in the panel this time just in case we need to go back and review it. So can you share your opinion on the state of owner adoption for standardization across industries? To narrow the scope of the question, I'm interested in the level of progress being made outside of the traditional plant owner operator environment, like automotive electrification and battery facility construction.
I'll be very forthright and say that I don't have a lot of experience either supporting or working in that sector specifically, so I can't really answer that more specific part of the question. When it comes to owner adoption of standards, I'm really just going to fall back on the development of these data requirements and the experience with the owners that I am working with that are mostly chemical and gas and some power generation. again, more and more folks are realizing it's all about the data. And when I mean it's all about the data, it's not the entire construction project is about the data. I'm talking about the implementation, the full implementation of AWP, and actually getting all of the value you can out of an AWP implementation is people are becoming more and more aware that it's about the data. And what the more mature, savvy owners are doing, and there are more and more of them, almost weekly, I would say, monthly now. We've slowed down a little bit because of COVID, of course, but is this sort of voice around both digital twin and also this call for AWP data requirements, right? Before they were just sort of very amorphous sort of topics that didn't have a lot of meat hanging on their bones, even though there was a lot of standards bodies work. But there's a very clear call for owners, number one, to begin contractually requiring AWP. And now we're seeing this call to not only contractually obligate AWP for the execution of a project, but now to centralize around this set of data requirements for AWP, which eliminates the ambiguity, right? Because I've been in a lot of these contractual negotiations on both sides where it's like, well, that's not required. Well, no, it is required. We need it. Well, it's going to cost you that. It's going to cost you that. And what this does is sort of, it is a landing place for everybody to go to and say, look, these were the participants. This is the vetting that went through these data requirements. These are the AWP data requirements. You know, we might augment that. We might not require every single one of these, and that will be within the contract. But what I'm seeing is more and more owners consolidating around a standard set of, but number one, best practices in AWP and the execution of the projects, but then also now coming together around this request to formalize these data requirements.
Perfect. I have 3 questions from Brett Farmer, who, and all the questions are sort of linked, and they're in this very relevant to this topic area. So we have about 8 minutes left, so we'll see if we can get through these, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Just go in order of when they were submitted. So first is, what's the dependency or importance of having an associated data platform, such as a data lake, information factory, etc., once these data requirements are understood / agreed to?
Yeah, and I'm going to go back to this AWP framework, this technology stack diagram. So what you see in the middle here is this. This is our integration layer. This is our selected product. When available, we'll work with ConstructX. We'll work with other providers as well. But warning.
Sorry to interrupt you. I think your screen share might be paused. We're just seeing the discussion slide. There we go.
I jumped on my second screen to that slide and it didn't go there. I apologize. Here we go.
No.
There we go.
Yep.
Yep.
It's changed. Okay.
All right. So, and I'm going to call this, we call this the integration layer, right? The data integration layer. Our data integration layer leverages digital threads and microservices that consume those digital threads once they're documented, and automates as much of this data exchange that is represented by these arrows as possible, right? If you do not have either a Borneo or a like system, you are either home growing, well, then you'd have a like system. Without a like system to do this integration layer, you're looking at point-to-point solutions, which are, and then you still have to worry about storage, right? But those point-to-point solutions are very costly and time-consuming, and I'm going to say at best difficult to maintain project to project. So having a sort of either a service bus or this data integration layer that leverages modern technologies and microservices, if you're not heading that direction, then you're going to struggle, as some are, with data management for your AWP implementations.
Okay, second part to the question. Are you seeing digital technology providers make traction on agreed interfaces or adapters that allow a more efficient data interface and integration management as a standard?
I'm going to say yes. I mean, absolutely. I can point to an organization that I'm on the board of called Moser. That is, I mean, its whole reason to ETRA is to fully federate data in an ecosystem where data exchanges at the machine level freely, right? And very actively participate in that. And once we have truly federated data, those point-to-point solutions become less of a problem. and data exchange becomes easier. You still have data quality issues and validation issues, but at least you can exchange the data at a machine level. But it does not eliminate the need on a project to do data validations, right? And let's say scrubbing for accuracy. But at least you would eliminate this sort of need for either point-to-point or this true data integration layer. I work towards and hope to see in my lifetime an environment where we have truly federated data, where suppliers are on board with connectors and they work. Some suppliers, vendors are working harder than others in those efforts, right? And that's sort of an ever-changing landscape, but there's definitely effort going towards that, and there's still momentum in that area. It's just for right now, my perspective is we're not quite there yet from a holistic perspective. Just in the same breath, I can say we don't have a digital twin. We have digital twins right now. Maybe in my lifetime, there will be a digital twin platform that is universally adopted, and it really truly is a one source of truth to manage them all, the one ring. But I don't foresee that really in my lifetime, especially around digital twins. I think that there's or digital twin. I think there's an opportunity there around federation and data exchange, but we're not quite there yet.
Awesome.
I'm going to put a caveat there, but there is absolutely work out there that can be leveraged, right, for these data exchanges. There's definitely work out there that can be leveraged if a company wants to.
Perfect. Part 3, do you have a recommendation on ensuring data quality, data integrity that's needed even once an agreed data requirement is established?
Yeah, and that really has to do with a company's maturity and the documentation of their digital threads. And I'm just going to move my slide there. Success is dependent upon your understanding and your ability to manage the exchanges and then the type of validations that are required for each exchange. And that's what the digital thread documentation is all about. What I'm showing now and what I've talked about very generally just in context of this presentation is generic. When you move into a specific environment, the digital threads have to be specific to that environment. They have to be explicitly understood by those that are responsible for managing them. And then it's within your best interest to have a platform with which to manage those digital threads and the actual data exchanges themselves with, like I'm showing you right now with this Borneo technology. So that's at a very high level, the considerations that you need to take in place for ensuring that the contractual obligation is being met, right? You have to have an understanding of what your request is, and then you have to have an understanding of how to consume that request and best produce business value from the data that's exchanged.
Steve, it's Lloyd here. We're sitting at 2 minutes to the hour now, and I just want to thank Ted for an amazing job of covering off the questions. I think there's still a couple that we won't get a chance to address, but Steve will forward those on to Ted. And Ted, if you could get back to the originators of those questions, Lee Tedstone and Vishnu. So want to just thank you for covering an incredibly broad amount of material in a short period of time. And just like to thank ConstructX for agreeing to do this session. We do have more sessions lined up for the next 5 weeks or so. And if there's anyone out there who has specific topics they'd like to see, please let us know. And the best way to do that is through the survey we've just circulated. So thanks very much. And I think it's time to end the session, Steve.
Great. Any closing comments from Ted?
Oh, just again, a very big thank you for this opportunity and for everybody for joining and listening this afternoon. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Ted. Thanks, everyone. And we will look forward to seeing you online next week for our next session. Take care.
Bye-bye.